Hello everyone, and welcome to our 1.4 notes on the midpoint between 2 points. And so we did, last week we did the distance formula, and so I just want to go ahead and give you a quick reminder. Whenever you find the distance between 2 points or the length of a segment, that is going to give you a single positive number. Because distance is always positive, it's going to give you a single positive number. Today, we're going to be finding the midpoint, and so here's how your answers are going to look. Midpoint is going to be a single XY pair. It's going to be the middle of your X's and then the middle of your Y's. So we're going to have our X middle number, and then we're going to have our Y middle number. The reason I bring this up is because sometimes students get confused. For midpoint, these values, these numbers right here and right here in your coordinate pair, they can be positive, they can be negative, they can be decimals. For distance, it's going to give you a single positive number. It can be a decimal, it does not have to be a whole number. But for midpoint, you can have negative numbers because we're just finding the middle coordinate. We've done this before, and you'll have seen this before, but I just wanted to go ahead and review that. Okay, so what is the midpoint, just as a review? The midpoint is going to be the middle of a line segment. The middle of a line segment is a point that divides or splits the line segment into two equal parts of length. So if this is my midpoint right here, it is going to divide this segment, segment AB, evenly in the middle to where A to M is the same length as B to M. And so here's my formula. It looks a little bit intimidating, but all you're doing is you're taking your X's and averaging them. So it's the average of your X values on the endpoints, and then the average of your Y values. So here are my Y values, here are my X values, and you're just finding the middle of those two values. And y'all are used to doing this. Like if I said, what is you're averaging two test grades, and you're finding the average of a 90 and a 92. Well, all of y'all know it's gonna be a 91. So in class, I said, well, then what if it was a 71 and an 83? Well, what would you do? And everyone in the class knew you'd add them together and you'd divide by 2, so it'd be a 77. And then if we did like a 71 and an 84, we'd add them together, divide by 2, and that would give me a 77.5. So it is okay to have a decimal answer here. And so what we did in class is we stacked them. And so we kind of jumped around. So just have your sheet of paper out. We're going to jump around a little bit. So here's our practice. We stacked our points just to show what we are doing. So if it says determine the midpoint between these endpoints, R is an endpoint and S is an endpoint, and it's at 1, -5, and then at -5, 7. If we wanted to find the middle between these 2 points, I'm going to call it M. We want to find the middle of our X values. So what are our X values? We would do 1 plus -5 divided by 2. And then my Y values would be -5 plus 7 divided by 2. And then I am just going to simplify that. So we did talk about in class, make sure that you type in the entire numerator and click enter, and then divide by 2. We do 1 plus -5, that's -4. -4 then divided by 2 is going to give me -2. Okay, so -2 would be the X value. -5 plus 7, enter, is 5 divided by 2 is going to give me 2.5. -5, oh, hold on, let me type that again. -5 plus 7 is 2, divided by 2 gives me 1. Sorry, guys, I typed it in wrong. And how did I know that I typed it in wrong? Because my answer should be in between -5 and 7, and 1 is perfectly in the middle. It's 6 away from -5 and 6 away from 7. And so what is my midpoint? My midpoint is the coordinate pair, -2, 1. Okay, so let's do that again. Determine the midpoint between these endpoints, T being at 1, 3, so we're just giving ourselves a visual stack here, U being at -4, 7. So I had the class pause and do this with their group members, and so if you're watching the video, pause this video and see how you do when you find the middle. So the middle would be 1 plus -4 divided by 2 would be my average of the X's. My average of the Y's would be 3 plus 7 divided by 2. So what is my midpoint going to be? That would be 1 plus -4 is -3 divided by 2 is -1.5. It is totally fine that it is a negative. 1 plus -4 divided by 2 is going to give you -1.5. And then 3 plus 7 is 10 divided by 2 is 5. So hopefully you got that when you're going back to check. These are the values of my midpoint, the XY point that's in the middle. And you could check it because 5 is perfectly in between 3 and 7, and then -1.5 is in between 1 and -4. All right, so we're actually going to skip ahead to the challenge problem. The reason that I had them stack these points in class is because sometimes instead of giving you two endpoints, so top and bottom, and boom, finding the middle like what we just did, they're going to give you an endpoint in the middle, and they want you to find the other endpoint. So here's the wording you're going to look for. The midpoint of JK is M. So let's go ahead and put JK on there. Here's J, here's K, and they give you a midpoint. What do they say the midpoint is? They tell you that the middle is 2, 1. So they're giving you the midpoint. Then they give you an endpoint in blue. J is at 1, 4. So there is a formula you could use, and I showed them how to do this formula in class, setting the midpoint formula equal to the midpoint value. So x1 plus x2 divided by 2 equals xm, and y1 plus y2 divided by 2 equals ym. I do it a little bit different. So the way I do this is I say, okay, we have the coordinates of the midpoint. This is truly in the middle. So if this is truly in the middle, how do I go the other direction? Well, how did I go from 2 to negative 1? How do you go from 2 to 1? You subtract 1. So if 2 is truly in the middle, I need to do the same thing, but the reverse on the other side. So what's the opposite of minus 1? We'd go plus 1. So what is 2 plus 1? 2 plus 1 gives me 3. How do you check it? You add the top and the bottom, divide by 2, and see if it gives you the middle. So what is 1 plus 3? That's 4. 4 divided by 2 does give me 2. Okay, so let's do that again. Let's look at the y value. Our 1 is in the middle. How do I get from 1 to positive 4? I go plus 3. So I want to go the other direction. I'm just going to do the inverse, which is minus 3. So what is 1 minus 3? That's going to give me negative 2. How do you know that you did it right? You would add your y values and divide by 2 and see if it gives you 1. So 4 plus negative 2 is 2. 2 over 2 gives me 1. So what is my other endpoint? My other endpoint would be at k, 3, negative 2. So stacking those helps, and that way you don't have to use the formula. All right, let's do that again. So challenge the midpoint of EH. So let's start with E and H. I'll give myself some room here. E and H. The midpoint of EH is M. So they give you the midpoint. They give you the point in the middle. Okay. It's at negative 4, 3 is the midpoint. They give you one of the endpoints. One of those endpoints is at negative 2, 7. And they want us to find what is the other endpoint. So again, look at the middle and see how far it is from that other endpoint. How do I get from negative 4 to negative 2? I'd add 2. So let's go the other direction and subtract 2. What is negative 4 minus 2 more? That's going to give me negative 6. Okay, how do I go from 3 to 7? I increase by 4, so plus 4. So I'm going to do the inverse, which is decrease by 4. 3 minus 4 gives me negative 1. So what is that other endpoint? H is at negative 6, negative 1. How do you check it? You'd average them together and make sure you, in fact, get that middle point. All right, so there's 2 like that to practice on the homework, I believe. All right, and then we went in a little bit of a different order. We started with the graph just because I felt like it was a little bit easier. Okay, so number 5, what is the midpoint between these 2 points graphed below? Unfortunately, you can't just look at the graph and see what the middle is. And so you can kind of guesstimate. I know that it needs to be somewhere on this segment. It needs to be happening somewhere right here. So if for my answer I get anything outside of that bubble, I know I did something wrong. So let's go ahead and find our coordinates, negative 5, 5. And then 2, negative 5. So let's stack those. Let's just call this AB, just to help keep me organized. A is going to be at negative 5, 5. B is going to be at 2, negative 5. And let's find the middle of that. So when I find my middle, I'm going to use my midpoint formula. That is going to be negative 5 plus 2 over 2. And then 5 plus negative 5 over 2. So what does that give me? Negative 5 plus 2 is negative 3. Negative 3 over 2 is negative 1.5. And then 5 plus negative 5 is 0. 0 divided by 2 is 0. So that means my midpoint is at the coordinates negative 1.5 up and down 0. So that is the midpoint, negative 1.5, comma 0. That is my answer for the midpoint. So when it says, what is the midpoint between the 2 points graphed below? I found it. That's in yellow. Now they want us to find the distance. So remember that when you do distance, especially when we're on a coordinate plane, it's really easy to draw in my invisible legs of my right triangle. And then you would just count from here all the way down. It's going to end up being 10 units when you count. From here to here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 is 7. So to find the distance between the two, we're going to plug it into the Pythagorean theorem. So I'm going to call this D for distance. I'm finding the length of this segment. When I do this, I'm finding the length of the segment for distance. So A squared plus B squared equals C squared. And we're going to plug in 10 and 7 equals my distance squared. So that's going to be, type in 10 squared plus 7 squared into your calculator, you get 149 equals d squared. And so d is going to be equal to the square root of 149. This is going to give me a single positive number for a distance or length of a segment. Distance between 2 points should be a positive number. The length of a segment should be a positive number. This is about 12.2. This makes sense as an answer because 12.2 is number one, a positive number. It's a single number and it's more than 10 and it's more than 7. Okay, so that's the distance between those 2 points. All right, let's look at this one. This one's done on a graph as well. What is the midpoint between these 2 points? Well, when you do this point is -1, -1. This point is -5, -5. What is the midpoint going to be? It's really easy even just to see it on this graph. Our midpoint is going to be at the point -3, -3. So really easy to see. There's my midpoint. What is the midpoint between these two? It is going to be at -3, -3. Now, what is the distance between these 2 points? I'm going to turn this into a right triangle. This is a 4 by 4 right triangle, and so whenever I find my distance, I'm going to plug that into the Pythagorean theorem. 4 squared plus 4 squared equals d squared, and then I'm going to do, that's 16 plus 16 is 32, equals d squared. Square root of 32, let's type that in. Square root of 32 is about 5.7 if I were to round it to the nearest tenth. So 5.65 is going to round up to about 5.7. That makes sense as an answer because it's a single number, it's a positive number, and 5.7 is more than 4 and more than 4. All right. We only did one of these two in class, and so I'm going to do both on the video just in case you wanted to see the other one worked out. It says find both the midpoint and the distance. We're going to do midpoint first between these endpoints, so R and S. So here's R, here's S. R is at 1, -5. S is at -5, 7. So what would be the coordinates of the midpoint? M. 1 plus -5 is -4 over 2 is -2. And then -5 plus 7 is 2 over 2 is 1. Okay, so there's my midpoint. What is the midpoint? I just found it. This is my midpoint. Now we want to know what is the distance. So when you find the distance, that's where you draw your right triangle. Okay, so there's my x values, there's my y values. What are my x values? 1 and -5. So how far is 1 away from -5? We'd subtract these. That is going to be 6 units away, and this leg is always going to be positive. Okay, so that was a 1 right there. That was a 1. Okay, let's do the same thing for my y values. What are my y values? -5 and 7. So from -5 all the way up to 7. How far are those apart? You'd subtract them. 7 minus -5 is going to give me 12. So what do I plug in for the distance? I plug in 12 and 6. So 12 squared plus 6 squared is going to be equal to my distance squared. It's going to be d. 12 squared plus 6 squared gives me 180 equals d squared, and I'm going to take the square root of that. So my distance of this segment is going to be a single positive number. It's about 13.4 if I rounded to my nearest tenth. That makes sense because it's a single positive number. It's more than 12 and it's more than 6. Okay, so there's my midpoint, there's my distance. Okay, some other classes worked this problem. So if you wanted a little bit of extra practice, find the midpoint, find the coordinates of the midpoint, and then find the length of this CD. That's just another fancy way to say find the distance. The length of CD gives you the distance of the segment. Okay, so let's do that. So let's go in purple, C to D. Here's point C, point D are the endpoints, it says, at -4, 3, and -6, 5. So if we want to find the middle, the midpoint, it's going to be the middle of -4 and -6. You could add those together and divide by 2. We know that's going to be -5. And then what is the middle of 3 and 5? This one's a little bit easier. That's going to be 4. And so here are the coordinates of my midpoint. Again, those can be negative because those are just coordinates, x, y coordinate pairs. Now when we want to find our distance, that is where I'm going to draw my triangle, my right triangle, just give myself a visual. Here are my x values, here are my y values. My x values are -4 and -6. How far are -4 and -6 apart from each other? That is going to give me 2. Remember, that's a positive number. Distance is always positive. Okay, let's look at the y values. What are my y values? Y values are 3 and 5. How far are 3 and 5 apart from each other? Again, that's going to be 2. So what do I plug into the Pythagorean theorem? I'm going to plug in 2 squared plus 2 squared equals d squared for distance. That's going to be 4 plus 4, which is 8. And then we take the square root of 8, which gives me about 2.8. A single positive number. 2.8 is more than 2, and 2.8 is also more than 2. So I know that is a good answer for the hypotenuse. That is the distance from C to D is 2.8. The midpoint from C to D is -5, 4. So your homework is on the back. We have a few where you're finding the midpoint and distance. Remember that midpoint is a single positive number. Midpoint is a coordinate pair. Sorry, y'all, I'm going fast. Midpoint is a coordinate pair, an XY coordinate pair. And then distance is going to be a single positive number, okay? We need a positive number there for that answer. 4 and 5 are just like the challenges that we tried, where you're given an endpoint and a midpoint and finding the other endpoint. And then 6 and 7 is just from a graph. So again, finding the midpoint and the distance on both of those. 6 is a little bit easier than 7. I hope you're having a fabulous day.